The heat over Miami that afternoon was the kind that made the air shimmer above the pool deck. Clem had been on her feet since 6 in the morning, carrying trays of iced drinks across the marble tiles of the Grand Bay Private Club, sweat sticking her uniform to her back, her smile never once slipping, even when her feet screamed at her to stop. Was used to being invisible. Waitresses at places like this were supposed to be invisible, but invisible didn't mean safe. Careful, careful, Julian Croft called out from his lounge chair, loud enough for the whole pool area to hear. He was 26, tanned, wearing sunglasses that cost more than Clem made in a month, and he'd been needling her since the moment she walked out with his group's second round of mojitos. Wouldn't want the tray to break under all that weight. His friends laughed. One of the women filmed it on her phone, giggling behind her manicured hand. Clem kept walking. She'd learned a long time ago that reacting only fed people like Julian. She set the tray down at the far table, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed somewhere past his head. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Julian said, standing now, blocking her path back. "Chubby girls like you shouldn't even be allowed poolside." Ba she dee for the view. The laughter grew louder. Clem's face burned, but she stepped sideways to walk around him. That's when his foot shot out. She didn't even see it coming. 1 second she was upright, tray balanced, and the next, the world tipped sideways, and the deep end of the pool rushed up to meet her. She hit the water hard, the shock of it stealing the breath from her lungs, chlorine burning her eyes as she sank, for one terrifying second, before her body remembered how to fight its way back to the surface. When she broke through, gasping, the entire pool deck was roaring with laughter. Phones were up. Someone shouted, "Get a life jacket." Someone else was already posting it online. The caption typed before Clem had even reached the ladder. She grabbed the rail, hauling herself out, drenched, humiliated, her uniform clinging to her, her hair plastered flat. She wanted to disappear into the tile. Instead, she stood there in front of 40 strangers, water dripping into a growing puddle, and she felt something inside her crack quietly, the way it always did, except this time there was nowhere to hide it. "Well, that was entertaining," Julian said, grinning at his friends. "Somebody give her a towel before she floods the place." That was when a voice cut through the noise. Not loud, not shouting, just clear enough that the laughter died almost instantly. Who authorized this? A man had stepped away from a shaded cabana near the bar, where he'd been sitting quietly all afternoon, unnoticed, nursing a glass of water and reading something on his phone. Clem hadn't even registered him before. Now every head on the deck turned. He was maybe 27, dressed simply for a place like this. No flashy watch, no logo shirt, nothing that screamed money. But the way people suddenly straightened in their chairs told Clem everything she needed to know. Something about him made the air feel different. He walked straight past Julian without looking at him and crouched beside Clem, pulling off his own linen jacket and wrapping it around her shoulders before she could even protest. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, quiet enough that it felt private, even with everyone watching. Clem shook her head, too stunned to speak. "Good." He stood, and when he turned to face the crowd, his voice changed completely. Cold, certain, the voice of a man who was done being patient. "My name is Dominic Moretti," he said. "I own 80% of this resort." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's smug grin slid right off his face. "I've spent the last 6 months walking through this club, unannounced, because I wanted to see how my staff actually get treated when management thinks no one's watching." Dominic's eyes moved slowly over the pool deck, over the stunned faces, over the phones that were now lowering one by one. Now I know. He turned to a man in a suit who'd come rushing over, pale and sweating. You're the floor manager? Yes, sir. You're done. Today, along with anyone else on shift who found this funny. Dominic's gaze landed on Julian last. And your membership is revoked, effective immediately. Security will help you find the exit. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but 2 security guards were already flanking him, and whatever he'd been about to say died somewhere in his throat. Dominic turned back to Clem, his expression softening completely, like the storm inside him only had one direction, and it wasn't toward her. Let's get you somewhere dry, he said, offering his arm like she was the only person on the deck that mattered. Clem stared at him, water still dripping off her chin, humiliation and disbelief tangled together in her chest. She didn't know this man. She didn't know why he'd stepped in, or why his voice had shaken with something that felt almost like recognition, like he'd been waiting for a reason to burn this place down for a while now. But as he led her past the stunned crowd, past Julian's furious, reddening face, past the pool that had almost swallowed her dignity whole, one thought settled quietly in her mind. Whatever came next, her life was never going back to what it was an hour ago. The car ride to Star Island was quiet. Clem sat wrapped in Dominic's jacket, her wet uniform sticking uncomfortably to the leather seat, watching the causeway blur past the window while her mind replayed the last hour on a loop. The laughter, the water closing over her head, the way Julian's face had gone slack with shock. She kept waiting for the humiliation to fade. It didn't. Dominic didn't push her to talk. He sat across from her, phone in hand, occasionally typing something short and clipped to someone on his staff. But every few minutes, his eyes flicked up to check on her, like he was making sure she was still breathing normally. You don't have to say anything, he finally told her as the car turned through a gated entrance lined with palm trees. But you're safe. That's the only thing I need you to know right now. The estate was nothing like Clem expected. She'd pictured marble columns and gold fixtures, the kind of excess she associated with men who owned resorts. Instead, the house was warm. Wood floors, big windows facing the water, the smell of fresh coffee somewhere in the back. It felt lived in. A woman named Priya met them at the door, calm and efficient, already holding a stack of folded clothes. Guest suites ready, she said, giving Clem a small, kind smile that didn't ask any questions. Bathrooms stocked. Take your time. Clem showered in silence, watching chlorine and humiliation swirl down the drain together, and when she came out in soft cotton clothes that actually fit her, she almost didn't recognize her own reflection. Not because she looked different, because for the first time in years, nobody in the room was staring at her like she was something to laugh at. Dinner was brought to her suite on a tray, but she found she couldn't eat much of it. Her stomach was still tight with anxiety, and it wasn't about the pool anymore. I lost my job today, she said out loud, mostly to herself, when Dominic knocked and stepped in to check on her. That was my only income. Rent's due in 8 days. He pulled a chair over and sat, not too close, giving her space. You didn't lose your job. The people who let that happen lost theirs. That's not how these things work, Clem said. Once a video like that goes up, nobody wants to hire the girl who fell in the pool. They want the version of the story that's easy to laugh at, not the truth. Dominic was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel seen rather than examined. How long were you working there? 3 years. Started as a hostess, moved to serving because it paid better. She wrapped her hands around a glass of water, needing something to hold. I used to want to go to culinary school. Life had other plans. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but real. Why culinary school? Clem let out a short laugh, surprised he'd asked. I like cooking. Really cooking. Not just reheating things. I used to help my grandmother in her kitchen back in Georgia before she passed. She taught me everything. Said food was the one language everybody understood, no matter where they came from. She shrugged, embarrassed suddenly by how much she'd revealed. Anyway, doesn't matter now. It matters, Dominic said, and something in his tone made her look up. I've been coming to that resort quietly for months, watching how things actually run day to day. I noticed you before today, Clem. She blinked. You knew my name? I make it my business to know who's actually holding a place together. He leaned forward slightly. You cover for the kitchen when they're short-staffed. You memorize regulars' orders without writing them down. Twice I watched you fix a mistake the chef made before a customer even noticed. That's not something you learn from a training manual. Clem didn't know what to say. Nobody had ever noticed those things, or if they had, they'd never said so out loud. I wasn't trying to be noticed, she said quietly. I was just trying to keep my job. I know. Dominic's voice was steady, certain in a way that made the anxious knot in her chest loosen slightly. Just slightly. That's exactly why I want to talk to you tomorrow, when you've had a night to rest. Not about the pool, not about Julian, about what happens next. What do you mean, what happens next? He stood, buttoning his jacket, his eyes holding hers for a beat longer than necessary. I mean, I don't think today was an accident that ruined your life, Clem. I think it was the first time somebody with enough power to actually do something about it happened to be standing there watching. He left her with that thought hanging in the room, warm food going cold on the tray beside her, and for the first time since she'd hit the water that afternoon, the tight fear in her chest eased just enough for her to breathe. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because of fear this time, but because some small, cautious part of her had started to hope, and hope was a feeling she'd trained herself not to trust. Outside her window, the lights of Miami blinked across the dark water, and somewhere in the house, she could hear Dominic's low voice on the phone, talking about contracts, about renovations, about someone named Vance, who apparently needed to be told something he wouldn't like. Whatever was coming tomorrow, Clem had the strange, unfamiliar sense that it might actually be good. Clem woke before sunrise out of habit, her body still running on 3 years of early shifts, even though nobody was expecting her anywhere. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the soft gray light coming off the water outside the window. And yesterday came rushing back in pieces. The pool, the laughter, Dominic's jacket around her shoulders. She lay there for a while, listening to the quiet. No alarm clocks, no clatter of dishes, no manager barking orders through a headset. Just waves against the seawall and the occasional call of a gull. Restlessness got the better of her. She wasn't someone who could sit still with nothing to do. So she pulled on the clothes Priya had left folded on the dresser and made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee that had drawn her out of the room the night before. The kitchen was empty. Big windows, an island counter with more space than Clem had ever cooked on in her life. Pots hanging from an iron rack overhead like they were waiting for someone to use them. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling like an intruder, before curiosity won out over caution. She opened the fridge. Eggs, fresh herbs, a block of good Parmesan, ripe tomatoes still on the vine, a loaf of sourdough that smelled like it had been baked that morning. Simple ingredients, but good ones. Her grandmother used to say you could tell everything about a cook by what they did with plain eggs and butter. Before she'd fully decided to do it, Clem had an apron off the hook, and a pan on the stove. She lost herself, the way she always did when she cooked, chopping herbs, whisking eggs with a splash of cream, the way her grandmother taught her, letting the tomatoes blister slowly in olive oil until they turned soft and sweet. She toasted the sourdough, rubbed it with garlic, layered it with the tomatoes. She made a soft scramble, folding it low and slow off the heat, the way most people never bothered to. It wasn't fancy, it was just done right. She was so absorbed, she didn't hear Dominic come in until he spoke. "That smells better than anything my chef has made me in months." Clem jumped, nearly dropping the pan. "I'm sorry. I should have asked. Don't apologize." He was leaning against the doorway in a plain shirt, hair still damp from a shower, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Is there enough for two?" There was. She plated the eggs over the toast, added a scatter of herbs, and set it in front of him at the island counter before serving herself a smaller portion. She stood there for a second, unsure if she was supposed to sit or wait, old habits from years of serving other people's meals dying hard. "Sit," Dominic said, nodding at the stool across from him. "Please." She sat. He took a bite, and Clem watched his face carefully, the way she always watched people's faces when they tried her cooking, a habit she couldn't shake even now. His eyebrows rose slightly. "This is genuinely excellent," he said. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My grandmother. She ran a small diner outside Savannah for almost 30 years. Clem picked at her own plate, suddenly shy. "I used to spend summers with her, standing on a stool so I could reach the stove. She always said good food doesn't need to show off, it just needs to be honest." She sounds like she knew what she was talking about. Dominic set his fork down, and something in his posture shifted, like he'd made a decision. "Clem, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer." She braced herself, waiting for the catch, the part where kindness turned out to have strings attached. She'd learned that lesson more than once. "I'm expanding into hospitality beyond the resort, private dining concepts, a boutique restaurant group, catering for high-level events. It's early, but it's real, and it's happening fast." He met her eyes directly. "I want you to run the culinary side of it. Executive culinary director, full creative control over menus, hiring your own kitchen staff, developing concepts from scratch." Clem stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I've never managed anything bigger than covering a coworker's tables. You've been running kitchens in your head for years, I'd guess. You just haven't had anyone hand you the actual keys." Dominic's voice was calm, matter of fact, none of the performative reassurance she might have expected. "I'm not offering you this because of yesterday. I'm offering it because of this breakfast, and because of 6 months of watching you work harder and smarter than people who outrank you." "This is insane," Clem said, half laughing, half stunned. "Yesterday, I was scraping mojito ice off my shoes. Today, you want to hand me a company? Not a company. Yet." A faint smile crossed his face. "But yes, that's exactly what I'm offering." Clem looked down at the plate between them, at the simple breakfast that had somehow rearranged the entire shape of her life in the span of one conversation. Part of her wanted to laugh it off as some strange dream she'd wake up from. But another part, the part that had spent years being underestimated and overlooked, felt something unfamiliar stir underneath the disbelief. Hope, mixed with something sharper. Maybe, for the first time, an actual chance. "Okay," she said quietly, before she could talk herself out of it. "Tell me everything." 3 days passed in a blur of paperwork, menu sketches, and long conversations with Dominic about what executive culinary director actually meant in practice. Clem spent most of her time in the estate's kitchen, testing recipes, filling notebooks with ideas she'd been storing in her head for years, with nowhere to put them. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself. On the fourth morning, she asked Priya if she could run out to a specialty market downtown for a few ingredients she couldn't find in the estate's pantry. Dominic offered a driver, but Clem wanted the walk, wanted a small taste of ordinary life again after 3 days inside a world that still didn't feel entirely real. She stopped at a coffee shop near the market to grab something to drink before heading back. That's when she noticed it. A group of people near the window kept glancing at her, then at their phones, then back at her again, whispering behind their hands. At first, Clem assumed she was imagining it, a habit built from years of being self-conscious in public. But then, a woman 2 tables over turned her phone screen toward her friend, and Clem caught a flash of something horribly familiar. Blue water, a tray flying through the air, herself, mid-fall, mouth open in shock. Her stomach dropped. She pulled out her own phone with shaking hands and searched her name, something she'd never had reason to do before. It didn't take long to find it. Julian had posted an edited version of the pool video, cut and captioned, to make it look like Clem had tripped on her own clumsiness and knocked over a tray of drinks onto paying guests before falling in herself. The caption read, "Grand Bay Club fires incompetent staff after chaos poolside. Some people just aren't built for high-end service." The video had thousands of views already. The comments were worse than Clem expected, and she'd expected the worst. She sat frozen at the small table, coffee going cold in front of her, feeling the same crushing weight from the pool deck settle back onto her chest, except this time it was spreading across the internet instead of staying contained to 40 strangers by a pool. She didn't remember walking back to the estate. She just remembered standing in the kitchen doorway, phone still clutched in her hand, when Dominic found her there 20 minutes later. "Clem." His voice was gentle, but sharp with concern. "What happened?" She turned the phone toward him wordlessly. He read the caption, watched a few seconds of the video, and his jaw tightened in a way she was starting to recognize. The same stillness that had come over him right before he dismantled the entire pool deck's management in under 2 minutes. "He's trying to control the story before I can," Dominic said quietly. "It's already working." Clem's voice cracked slightly, and she hated herself for it. People believe what they see first. Doesn't matter if it's true. I'm going to be the girl who fell in the pool and lied about why, and now you're going to be dragged into it because you gave me a job out of pity. "Pity had nothing to do with it," Dominic said firmly. "And I don't care what strangers on the internet think of me, but you should care what they think of your new restaurant group before it even opens." Clem set the phone down on the counter like it had burned her fingers. "Dominic, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe I should just take whatever severance you're willing to give me and disappear quietly, before I become a headline that follows your company around for the next 5 years. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but once it was out, she realized how much she meant it. Fear was easier to sit with than hope. Hope had already been proven fragile once this week. Dominic crossed the kitchen and stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to look up at him. "Do you actually want to walk away?" he asked. "Or are you just scared, and it's easier to quit than to fight?" The question landed harder than she expected. Clem opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, because she didn't have a good answer. Both things were true at once, and she hated that he'd seen it so clearly. "I've spent my whole life being the punchline," she said finally, quieter now. "I don't know how to be anything else in front of people who've already decided what I am. Then let's decide it for them instead." Dominic's voice softened, but there was steel underneath it. That video is a lie, and lies fall apart the second real facts show up next to them. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to trust me with this. Clem studied his face, searching for the catch she still half expected to find. She didn't find one. Just quiet certainty, the same certainty that had made an entire pool deck go silent 4 days ago. "What do you have in mind?" she asked. A faint, dangerous smile crossed his face, the kind that told Clem Julian Croft had made a serious mistake, underestimating exactly who he was dealing with. "There's a gala tomorrow night in Wynwood," Dominic said. "Investors, hospitality leaders, half the people who matter in this city's business circles. I was already planning to introduce you as my head chef." He paused, letting that settle. "Now we're just going to make sure everyone in that room hears the truth, before Julian gets the chance to twist it again." Clem felt something steady inside her chest, for the first time since she'd seen that video. Fear was still there, but underneath it, something sturdier was starting to take root. "Okay," she said, "let's go set the record straight." The Wynwood Art District event hall was lit up gold when their car pulled in the next evening, the kind of glow that made everything look important. Clem stood outside the entrance in a dress Priya had helped her pick out that afternoon, deep emerald, simple but well cut, and for a moment she almost turned back toward the car. "You look like you belong here," Dominic said, reading her hesitation without her having to say a word. "I feel like everyone in there already watched that video," Clem said. "Some of them probably did." He offered his arm, steady and unbothered. "Let them watch what happens next instead." Inside, the hall buzzed with conversation, string lights strung between exposed brick columns, waiters moving through the crowd with trays of small plates that Clem's professional eye immediately picked apart and judged. Investors in tailored suits clustered near the bar. A jazz trio played somewhere near the back. It was exactly the kind of room Clem had spent years serving in, never once imagining she'd walk through the front door as a guest. Dominic introduced her as they moved through the crowd, and Clem watched carefully for the flicker of recognition on people's faces the moment they connected her to the video. It happened more than once. A woman's smile went tight. A man's eyes dropped briefly to his phone. But Dominic never let the conversation linger there, steering each introduction toward Clem's actual work, the concepts she was developing, the tasting menu she'd already started sketching out for the flagship restaurant. It was working, slowly, until Julian Croft walked in. He arrived loud, the way he did everything, trailed by 2 men Clem didn't recognize, clearly there to impress investors of his own family's firm. He spotted Clem across the room almost immediately, and his mouth curved into the same smirk she remembered from the pool deck. "Didn't expect to see the help at an event like this," he said, loud enough to turn a few heads as he approached. "Or is this some kind of charity gesture, Moretti? Taking in strays?" The conversation around them quieted. Clem felt her pulse jump, old instincts screaming at her to shrink, to apologize, to disappear into the background, the way she always had. She forced herself to stand still instead. "Julian," Dominic said pleasantly, like he was greeting an old acquaintance rather than a man he'd banned from his own resort. "Funny you'd bring up charity. I was actually planning to discuss your firm tonight." Julian's smirk faltered slightly. "Excuse me? I've been going through the Grand Bay Club's vendor contracts this week." Dominic's voice stayed calm, conversational, but it carried across the space around them with an authority that made people lean in instead of look away. "Turns out your family's firm has been quietly behind on venue payments across 3 of your properties. Not late fees, actual defaults. Over $4 million combined, if my accountant's numbers are right." a ripple moved through the small crowd that had gathered. Someone near the bar lowered their phone entirely. "That's private financial information," Julian snapped, color rising in his face. "You have no right." "Public record, actually," Dominic said mildly. "I just happened to be the one who bothered to read it." He gestured toward Clem without looking away from Julian. "This is Clem, my executive culinary director, the woman you tried to humiliate online after you shoved her into a pool in front of 40 witnesses, several of whom, I've learned, are more than happy to confirm what actually happened that day." "It was a joke," Julian said, his voice losing its confident edge. "She's being dramatic. She fell 6 feet into deep water because you tripped her," Dominic said, and something in his tone finally sharpened into something cold. "And then you edited footage to make it look like her fault, to protect your own reputation while you're sitting on millions in unpaid debt. I'd say she's not the one who should be embarrassed tonight." The room had gone almost silent now, every conversation nearby dying as people turned to watch. Julian looked around, clearly realizing for the first time that he had no allies in that particular circle, not with numbers like that hanging in the air. Clem felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, replacing the old instinct to shrink. She stepped forward slightly, meeting Julian's eyes directly for the first time since the pool deck. "You wanted a story," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Here's the real one. I got pushed into a pool by a grown man who thought it was funny, and instead of losing everything like you wanted, I got handed an opportunity most people never see in their lifetime." She let that sit for a second. "So thank you, actually. You just made a very expensive mistake." A few people near them actually laughed. Quiet, but real. And Clem watched Julian's face go rigid with humiliation, the exact mirror of what she'd felt 4 days ago beside that pool. He didn't have a comeback. For the first time since she'd met him, Julian Croft simply turned and walked away, his 2 companions trailing awkwardly behind him, whispers already starting up in his wake. Dominic looked down at Clem, something like pride flickering across his expression. "How do you feel?" Clem let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 4 days straight. "Lighter," she admitted. "Good," Dominic said, "because that's just the first room." "Where were you?" "There are plenty more people in this city who need to hear the real story, too." Clem looked around at the gala, at the investors who were now watching her with genuine curiosity instead of pity. And for the first time since the pool, she let herself believe that maybe, finally, the story was starting to belong to her again. The drive to Orlando took almost 3 hours, and Clem spent most of it staring out the window, watching Florida flatten into orange groves and stretches of open sky. Dominic worked quietly beside her, occasionally glancing over, like he was checking whether her nerves had settled. "They hadn't. You've been quiet since we left Miami," he finally said, closing his laptop. "I keep thinking about Orlando." Clem picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "You're introducing me to food critics, people who actually know what they're talking about. Not investors who care about numbers on a spreadsheet, but people who'll taste what I make and know immediately if I don't belong there." "You do belong there. You keep saying that like it settles it." Clem gave a short laugh, more nervous than amused. "I've never plated for critics. I've never even had a menu with my name attached to it. What if the gala was a fluke? What if I get in that kitchen and freeze?" Dominic considered her for a moment. "Then you'll figure it out in real time, because that's what you did on the pool deck, and that's what you did at the gala. You don't fall apart under pressure, Clem. You've just never been given the stage to prove it to yourself." The test kitchen, when they arrived, was smaller than Clem expected, a sleek space tucked into a converted warehouse near downtown Orlando, all steel counters and good lighting, built for exactly this kind of trial run. Dominic had arranged for 4 local food critics to attend, along with 2 potential investors interested in the boutique concept. Clem walked the space alone for a few minutes before anyone arrived, running her hand along the counters, testing the stove, letting her nerves settle into something closer to focus. This was the part she actually understood, not the business meetings, not the gala small talk, but the quiet choreography of a working kitchen. By the time the critics arrived, she'd already decided on her menu, a series of dishes built around her grandmother's recipes, but elevated, refined, telling a story instead of just filling plates. Seared scallops with a brown butter grits foundation, a short rib dish braised low and slow until it fell apart, plated over creamy polenta with charred greens. A dessert built from a peach cobbler her grandmother used to make every summer, deconstructed just enough to feel modern without losing its soul. She worked in near silence as the critics settled at a small tasting table, Dominic standing off to the side, close enough to support her, but far enough to let this be entirely hers. The first plate went out. Clem watched from the pass, her stomach tight, as one of the critics, an older woman with sharp eyes and a reputation Clem had read about online the night before, took her first bite of the scallops. The woman paused, set her fork down, took a second bite. "This grits base," she said slowly. "This isn't restaurant technique. This is someone's grandmother's recipe, isn't it?" Clem's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am. My grandmother's, from Georgia. You can taste it," the woman said, almost to herself. "Most chefs try to hide where they learn to cook. You're not hiding it. You're building on top of it." She looked up, meeting Clem's eyes directly. "That's rare." The short rib went out next, then the deconstructed cobbler, and by the third course, the table had stopped taking notes and started simply eating, which Clem knew from years of watching diners was the highest compliment a kitchen could receive. Nobody critiques a plate they can't stop finishing. When the tasting ended, one of the investors leaned toward Dominic. "Where did you find her?" "She found herself," Dominic said. "I just happened to be paying attention." The critics left with genuine warmth, one of them already talking about a feature piece, another asking for Clem's card before remembering she didn't have one yet and settling for her number instead. Clem stood in the middle of the kitchen after the last guest left, hands still faintly trembling, disbelief and relief tangled together in her chest. "You did that," Dominic said, walking over, something warm and unmistakably proud in his voice. "Every bit of it was you." "I kept waiting to mess up," Clem admitted, "the whole time, waiting for the moment it would all fall apart. It didn't. No." She let herself smile, really smile, for what felt like the first time in days. "It didn't." Dominic studied her for a long moment, something shifting quietly behind his eyes that Clem couldn't quite name yet, something that felt bigger than business, though neither of them said it out loud. "I told you back at the estate," he said instead. "You've been running kitchens in your head for years. Today was just the first time anyone handed you the keys and got out of the way." Clem looked around the empty test kitchen, at the plates being cleared, at the space that had held her nerves and her grandmother's recipes and, somehow, the first real proof that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The imposter syndrome hadn't vanished completely. She suspected it might never fully disappear, but for the first time it felt smaller than the confidence sitting right beside it. And that, Clem thought as they walked out into the warm Orlando evening, was enough to build on. The lounge in Tampa didn't have a sign outside, just a plain black door in an alley behind a cigar shop, The kind of place that existed for people who preferred not to be found by accident. Clem waited in the car while Dominic went inside for what he'd only described to her as a meeting with some of the older partners. She hadn't asked too many questions about what exactly Dominic's business empire consisted of beyond hospitality and resorts. There were things about him she sensed but didn't push on, the way certain men around him deferred a little too quickly, the way security seemed to appear and disappear without being asked. She'd decided, somewhere over the last 2 weeks, that some doors were better left unopened until she was invited through them herself. Inside, the lounge was dim and quiet, leather chairs arranged around a low table where 3 men sat waiting. Dominic recognized all of them. Marcus Reyes, 71 years old, one of the founding partners of the old syndicate his father had built decades ago. Beside him, Aldo Ferrara, sharp-eyed and unreadable, and younger than the other 2 but no less influential. And Victor Salt, the quietest of the 3, who rarely spoke unless something genuinely troubled him. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing at the empty chair across from them. "We need to talk about your hospitality expansion." Dominic sat, unbothered, though he understood exactly why this conversation had been called. "I assumed word would reach you eventually." "Word reached us fast," Aldo said. "You've put a former waitress in charge of a multi-million-dollar restaurant group. No experience, no formal training, no track record. People are asking questions, Dominic. Questions about your judgment." "Her name is Clem," Dominic said evenly, "and she earned that position." "She fell in a pool," Victor said quietly, the first thing he'd said since Dominic sat down. "That's what people know about her. That's the story circulating." "That story was manufactured by a spoiled rich kid trying to protect his own failing finances," Dominic said. "The real story is a woman who ran a working kitchen better than trained professionals for 3 years without anyone noticing, because nobody bothered to look past her uniform." Marcus leaned forward, studying Dominic carefully. "This isn't about whether she can cook. We've all heard she's talented. This is about optics, about trust, about handing serious money to someone with no name behind her in an industry where reputation is everything. My father built this organization on the idea that talent and loyalty matter more than bloodlines," Dominic said, his voice steady but firm. "He didn't inherit his instincts from a boardroom. He built them from nothing, the same way Clem is building her career from nothing right now. If we only ever promote people who already come from money and connections, we're not building anything new. We're just protecting the same old walls." Aldo exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Sentiment is a dangerous thing to run a business on." "It's not sentiment," Dominic said. "It's strategy. Every legitimate business we build gives this organization more cover, more clean revenue, more distance from the parts of our history none of us particularly want, followed by federal auditors. Clem isn't a liability. She's the future of exactly the kind of clean growth we've been talking about for years, and she happens to be genuinely brilliant at what she does. That's not luck. That's an asset most competitors would kill to have." Victor studied Dominic for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You sound very certain for someone who's known this woman 2 weeks. I've watched her handle public humiliation, sabotage, and a room full of skeptical investors without losing her composure once," Dominic said. "I've watched critics who've spent 30 years in this industry go quiet the moment they tasted her food. Give me a name in this room who impressed you that fast." Nobody answered. Marcus sat back slowly, considering. And if she fails? If this expansion collapses under her? Then it fails because the market didn't want it, not because she wasn't capable, Dominic said. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think in a year, the people questioning this decision are going to be asking how they can get a table at her restaurant. The room was quiet for a long moment. Aldo finally exhaled, something between amusement and reluctant respect crossing his face. You always did have your father's stubbornness. I'll take that as a compliment. Take it however you want, Marcus said, though something in his tone had softened. You have our patience, Dominic. Not our full confidence yet. Earn that with results, not speeches. That's all I'm asking for, Dominic said. He left the lounge 20 minutes later, the humid Tampa night settling over him as he walked back toward the car, where Clem sat waiting, watching him carefully through the windshield. How did it go? She asked, as he slid into the seat beside her. They're skeptical, Dominic said honestly. Old habits, old ways of thinking. They'll come around once the numbers speak for themselves. Clem studied his face, something uncertain flickering behind her eyes. Did I make things harder for you? With whoever you just met? You made things honest, Dominic said. That's always harder, at least in the beginning. He reached over, briefly resting his hand over hers, a small gesture that carried more weight than either of them said out loud. But it's the only kind of foundation worth building anything on. Clem nodded slowly, though the quiet unease in her chest didn't fully disappear. Somewhere out there, people were watching her, weighing her, deciding whether she deserved the chance she'd been given. She intended to prove every single one of them right, to bet on her. The renovation site on the Miami riverfront had become Clem's second home over the past 2 weeks. What used to be an empty commercial shell was slowly turning into Clem's Kitchen, her flagship restaurant, with exposed brick walls, warm lighting fixtures being installed overhead, and a kitchen layout she'd designed herself down to the placement of every burner. The soft launch was 3 days away, and Clem had barely slept, running through recipes late into the night, adjusting seasoning ratios, testing plating one more time, even though she'd already tested it a dozen times before. She'd sent the last of her prep staff home around 10 that night, wanting a few hours alone in the kitchen to work through her final tasting menu in peace. She was elbow-deep in a sauce reduction, humming quietly to herself when she heard something shift in the back hallway near the walk-in refrigeration units. Clem froze, wooden spoon still in hand. The restaurant was supposed to be empty. Security had already done their evening walkthrough and left. She strained to listen, half convinced she'd imagined it, until she heard it again, a deliberate scrape of metal against metal, coming from the direction of the refrigeration room. Her pulse quickened, but instinct, not panic, took over. She set the spoon down quietly and moved toward the sound, staying close to the wall, until she reached the doorway of the back hall and saw a man in dark clothes crouched beside the main refrigeration unit, a tool in his hand, working at the compressor wiring with focused, practiced movements. Clem recognized the type of damage immediately. She'd spent years in kitchens watching equipment fail, and what he was doing wasn't an accident. He was deliberately sabotaging the cooling system, the exact thing that would spoil every ingredient she'd sourced for the soft launch and set the entire opening back by weeks. Her mind raced through her options in the span of a heartbeat. She was alone, there was no security nearby, and confronting him directly could be dangerous. But letting him finish would destroy everything she'd worked toward for the last month. She backed away as quietly as she'd come, moving fast toward the pantry storage room that sat adjacent to the refrigeration unit, connected by a single narrow hallway with only one other exit, the same exit the man would need to use to leave. Clem's hands shook as she pulled her phone out and fired off a single text to the head of the site's overnight security team, her fingers moving faster than her nerves wanted to allow. Then she positioned herself near the pantry door, waiting, listening to the sounds of the man finishing his work in the refrigeration room. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, tool bag in hand, satisfied with whatever damage he'd done, Clem moved. She shoved the heavy pantry door shut behind him with everything she had, the narrow hallway giving her just enough leverage, and threw the exterior deadbolt before he'd even fully registered what happened. He slammed against the door from the inside almost immediately, shouting, but the old commercial door held firm, built decades ago for a building that had once stored far heavier things than an angry saboteur. "Let me out!" he yelled, pounding against the wood. "Not a chance," Clem said, her voice steadier than she felt, backing away from the door while keeping her phone gripped tightly in her other hand. Security arrived within 4 minutes, followed shortly by 2 of Dominic's men, who Clem realized must have been alerted the moment her text went out. The man inside the pantry, when the door was finally opened under careful supervision, turned out to be a former resort manager, one of the staff members fired the day of the pool incident, and it didn't take much digging for Dominic's people to trace the payment back to an account connected to Julian Croft's family firm. Dominic arrived at the site within the hour, still in the clothes he'd clearly thrown on the moment he got the call, his expression a mixture of fury and barely restrained relief when he found Clem standing in the half-finished dining room, shaken but unharmed. "Are you hurt?" His hands went briefly to her shoulders, checking, before he seemed to remember himself and stepped back slightly. "I'm fine," Clem said, and this time she actually meant it. Scared, but fine. He was trying to ruin the refrigeration units before the launch. "He won't be trying anything else," Dominic said, his jaw tight as he looked toward the pantry room where the man was being handed over to the responding officers. "Julian's getting bolder and stupider. You think this traces back to him?" "I know it does," Dominic said, "and this time there's a paper trail that'll be very hard for him to explain away." Clem exhaled slowly, adrenaline finally starting to fade, leaving her hands trembling in its wake. "I didn't even think. I just moved." "That's exactly the point," Dominic said, something like pride cutting through his anger as he looked at her. "You didn't panic. You didn't wait for someone else to fix it. You handled a genuine crisis alone, in the middle of the night, days before your launch, and you won." Clem looked around at her half-finished restaurant, at the walls she'd chosen the color for herself, at the refrigeration unit that would need repairs before the launch could go forward as planned. It should have felt like a setback. Instead, standing there in the quiet aftermath, she felt something new settle into place inside her chest. She wasn't just capable of building this, she was capable of protecting it too. 3 days, she said quietly, more to herself than to Dominic. "We still open in 3 days." Dominic looked at her, something unmistakably certain in his expression. "Then let's make sure nothing else gets in the way." The boardroom on the 40th floor of the Brickell high-rise had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay, the kind of view meant to remind everyone in the room exactly how much money was at stake in whatever conversation happened next. Clem stood near the small catering station she'd set up in the adjoining prep room, checking her plates one final time, her nerves sharper than they'd been even at the gala. This wasn't a room full of curious investors or skeptical critics. This was a summit of international business leaders Dominic had spent months courting, men and women who controlled capital that could either launch the entire hospitality division into serious growth or quietly bury it before it ever got off the ground. The refrigeration sabotage 2 weeks earlier had delayed the flagship restaurant's opening by 9 days, and Clem knew this summit was, in many ways, Dominic's way of proving to the room that the setback hadn't slowed anything that actually mattered. "You ready?" Dominic asked, stepping into the prep room in a dark suit, looking every bit the confident businessman the room upstairs expected to see, though Clem had learned to notice the small signs of tension underneath his calm, the way his jaw set slightly tighter before something important. "As ready as I'll ever be," Clem said, wiping her hands on her apron. "This isn't a tasting menu I get to explain slowly over 3 courses. I've got maybe 40 minutes to convince a room full of strangers that funding this is a good idea." "You don't need to convince them with words," Dominic said. "That's what the food is for." Clem had spent the last week designing a menu specifically for this room, something that told her story without needing her to stand up and explain it herself. She started with a simple dish, a chilled corn soup with just a touch of smoked paprika oil, humble ingredients elevated through technique rather than expense, meant to ease the room in gently. From there, she moved into her short rib course, the same dish that had won over the critics in Orlando, now refined even further, plated with confidence instead of nerves. She watched through the small serving window as the dishes made their way around the boardroom table, watched the postures of the executives shift slightly with each course, conversation slowing as people actually focused on what was in front of them instead of their phones or their notes. It was the final course that mattered most, though. Clem had debated for days over what to end with, before finally landing on something deeply personal, a deconstructed version of her grandmother's peach cobbler, the same dish she'd served in Orlando, but plated this time with a small handwritten card beside each dessert, a few sentences about a Georgia diner, and a grandmother who'd taught a granddaughter that food built bridges no boardroom ever could. She hadn't told Dominic about the cards. She'd added them herself that morning, on instinct. When the plates came back to the prep room afterward, one of them had the card flipped over, something scrawled on the back in unfamiliar handwriting. Clem picked it up, curious, and found a short note from one of the investors, an older woman from Singapore who Dominic had mentioned was notoriously difficult to win over. "This is the first meal in years that made me think about my own mother's kitchen. Whatever you're building, I want to be part of it." Clem stood there for a long moment, the card trembling slightly in her hand, before Dominic stepped back into the prep room, his expression unreadable in a way that made her stomach drop, until he finally spoke. "They want to talk numbers," he said. "All of them, immediately." Clem's mouth went dry. "All of them?" Every single investor at that table just committed verbally to funding the full hospitality expansion. A slow smile broke across his face, genuine and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "You didn't just win them over, Clem. You made them emotional in a room built specifically to avoid emotion. I've watched grown men negotiate multi-million-dollar deals in there, without blinking. You had them setting down their forks to read handwritten notes about your grandmother." "I didn't think it would work," Clem admitted, relief and disbelief crashing into her at once. "I almost didn't even write those cards." "That instinct is exactly why this is going to work," Dominic said. "You don't just cook well, Clem. You understand something most people in that boardroom lost years ago. Food isn't just a product. It's a story. You gave them a story they wanted to invest in." Later that evening, after the paperwork had started moving and the summit had officially closed, with commitments totaling more than triple what Dominic had originally projected, Clem stood by the boardroom windows alone for a moment, looking out over the bay as the city lights began flickering on below. 3 weeks ago, she'd been serving mojitos in a uniform that never quite fit right, invisible to the people around her in every way that mattered. Now she'd just single-handedly convinced a room full of international investors to fund an entire restaurant empire, using nothing but honest food and a story about a small diner outside Savannah. Dominic joined her at the window, quiet for a moment before he spoke. Julian's still out there, still angry, still looking for ways to slow this down. Let him look, Clem said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. He can't touch what just happened in that room. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, something warmer than pride settling into his expression. No, he agreed quietly. He really can't. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded to Dominic from his legal team, with a subject line that read simply, "Croft Firm Status Update." Clem read it over his shoulder at the kitchen island, the two of them sharing coffee before another long day of restaurant prep. Julian Croft's family firm had officially filed for financial restructuring. The unpaid venue debts Dominic exposed at the gala had triggered a cascade of scrutiny from other business partners, other creditors, all of them suddenly far less patient once the first domino fell. Combined with the exposed sabotage attempt at Clem's restaurant, which had led to criminal charges against the hired saboteur and an ongoing investigation into who'd paid him, Julian's reputation across Miami's business circles had collapsed almost entirely within a month. "He's requested a meeting," Dominic said, scrolling further down the email, "at the Grand Bay Club. Says he wants to speak with you directly, on site, this week." Clem set her mug down slowly. "Why would he want to talk to me?" "My guess," Dominic said, "is that he's run out of other options, and someone's advised him that a public apology might be the only thing left that could salvage what's left of his name in this city." Clem thought about it for a long moment. Part of her wanted nothing to do with Julian Croft ever again, wanted to leave that entire chapter sealed shut behind her. But another part of her, the part that had spent years being underestimated and pushed aside, felt something like curiosity pulling her toward the idea of standing in that exact spot again, not as the girl who fell, but as someone entirely different. "I'll go," she said finally, "but I want you there too." They arrived at the Grand Bay Club 4 days later, on a bright, clear afternoon, the pool deck looking almost unrecognizable under new management, renovated and restaffed in the weeks since Dominic's initial overhaul. Clem walked the same path she'd walked a month earlier, except this time she wore a tailored blazer instead of a uniform, and the staff greeting her at the entrance did so with genuine respect rather than the polite indifference she used to receive. She was there to inspect the property, officially, in her new role, one Dominic had announced just days earlier without much warning, Vice President of Hospitality, overseeing not just the flagship restaurant, but the entire resort's dining and service culture going forward. Julian was waiting near the pier at the edge of the pool deck, noticeably thinner than Clem remembered, dressed more plainly than his usual designer wardrobe, the confidence that once radiated off him entirely gone. He looked, Clem thought, like a man who'd finally run out of rooms willing to laugh at his jokes. "Clem," he said as she approached, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Thank you for coming." The pool deck had gone quiet around them, staff members pausing their work, a few guests glancing over discreetly, clearly aware of who Julian was and what this moment likely represented. "I don't have a good excuse for what I did," Julian said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I was cruel to you, because it was easy, because I thought there'd never be any consequences for someone like you, and I was wrong about all of it." He paused, swallowing hard. "The video, the lies I spread afterward, That was worse than the push itself, honestly. I tried to take away the one thing you actually had left, your reputation, because I was embarrassed, and I wanted someone else to hurt more than I did. Clem stood quietly, letting him finish, feeling none of the satisfaction she might have expected weeks ago, when this apology would have meant everything to her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Julian continued. "I just needed to say it out loud, in front of people, the same way I humiliated you in front of people." Seemed like the only way to actually mean it. Clem considered him for a long moment, the pier sunlight warm on her shoulders, the pool that had once swallowed her dignity now sparkling quietly behind him, empty and calm. "You didn't just hurt me that day," she said finally, her voice steady. "You reminded me how small people can be when they think they'll never face consequences. But you also handed me a chance most people never get, because Dominic was standing there watching, and everything that followed happened because of that moment." She let that settle. "I'm not going to pretend what you did didn't hurt. It did, but I'm also not going to let it define me anymore. And honestly, Julian, I stopped needing your apology the moment I realized I'd already moved past needing anything from you at all." Julian nodded slowly, something like genuine humility crossing his face, an expression Clem never expected to see from him. "For what it's worth, the restaurant everyone's talking about downtown, I heard it's incredible." "It is," Clem said simply. No bitterness in it, just fact. She turned to walk away, back toward Dominic, who'd been standing quietly, a respectful distance off, watching without interfering, letting this moment belong entirely to her. As she walked, the staff around the pool deck, who'd paused to watch, slowly returned to their work, but something in the air had shifted, the old story finally, fully closed. "How do you feel?" Dominic asked when she reached him. Clem looked back once at the pier, at Julian standing alone by the water he'd once thrown her into, small now in a way he'd never been before. "Free," she said, and meant it completely. Star Island glowed under strings of warm lights, the night of the grand opening, the entrance to Vance & Co., culinary house framed in soft gold, waiters moving through a crowd of nearly 200 guests, with trays of dishes Clem had spent a month perfecting. She stood near the kitchen pass in a deep navy dress, watching the dining room fill with people who'd come from across the city, some out of genuine curiosity, others simply because word had spread fast about the woman behind the food. It didn't feel real yet. 30 days ago, she'd been pulling wet hair out of her face beside a pool, humiliated in front of strangers. Tonight, those same strangers and hundreds more were paying for the privilege of tasting what she'd built. "Table 6 wants to know if the chef's coming out," one of her line cooks said, poking his head into the pass. "Third time they've asked." Clem laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tell them I'm coming." She'd stepped out twice already that evening, moving through the dining room, thanking guests, answering questions about her grandmother's recipes, with the same warmth she used to give customers back at the Grand Bay Club. Except now, people actually listened when she spoke. The restaurant itself looked nothing like the empty shell it had been weeks earlier. Warm brick walls, low lighting, an open kitchen where guests could watch her teamwork, everything designed exactly how she'd imagined it during those long nights, testing recipes in Dominic's estate kitchen. Dominic found her near the pass around 9, pulling her gently aside from the noise of the dining room into the quieter hallway near his office. "Everything all right?" Clem asked, noticing the folder in his hand. "Everything's perfect," he said. "I just need 5 minutes of your time before the night gets away from us completely." He led her into the small office, closing the door softly behind them, muting the sound of the celebration outside to a low hum. Clem watched him set the folder down on the desk, something careful in his expression that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. "I've been thinking about this since Orlando," Dominic said. "Since the moment those critics stopped taking notes and just started eating." He opened the folder, sliding a set of documents across the desk toward her. "This isn't a promotion, Clem. I want to be clear about that." Clem picked up the papers, scanning quickly, her eyes catching on words she had to read twice to fully understand. Equal executive partnership, full ownership stake in the hospitality division, her name listed alongside his, not underneath it. "Dominic," she said slowly, looking up at him. "This is half the company. It's what you built," he said simply. "I gave you a kitchen and an opportunity. Everything that happened after that, the menu, the investors, the way you handled Julian, the way you protected this place the night someone tried to sabotage it, that was all you. I'm not interested in owning something you built with your own hands while you work for me. I want a partner, not an employee." Clem's throat tightened, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. "A month ago, I didn't even have a job. Now you're handing me half of everything. A month ago, you were already doing the work of someone who deserved far more than what you were given," Dominic said, stepping closer. "I just happened to be the one who finally noticed and did something about it. The credit belongs to you." She set the papers down carefully on the desk, looking at him for a long moment, searching his face the way she had that very first night at the estate, when she'd been waiting for the catch that never came. "Why me?" she asked quietly, the question she'd never quite let herself ask out loud. "Out of everyone, why did you stop that day? Why did any of this happen?" Dominic was quiet for a moment, something more vulnerable crossing his expression than she'd seen from him before. "Because I spent months watching people at that resort treat hard-working staff like they were invisible, and I told myself I was documenting it for business reasons, gathering evidence to clean house eventually." He paused. "But the truth is, I kept finding excuses to watch you specifically. The way you worked, the way you carried yourself, even when people were unkind to you. I think some part of me already knew you were extraordinary, long before that day at the pool gave me a reason to finally step in." Clem felt something warm settle in her chest, steadier than surprise, quieter than the disbelief she'd carried through most of the last month. "That's not exactly a business reason." "No," Dominic admitted, a small smile breaking through. "It really isn't." She picked the papers back up, signing her name where he indicated, her hand steadier than she expected, given how much weight sat behind that single signature. When she finished, Dominic took the folder gently, setting it aside, and for a moment they simply stood there in the quiet office, the celebration continuing without them, just beyond the door. "Ready to go back out there?" he asked. "Your restaurant is waiting." "Our restaurant," Clem corrected softly. Dominic's smile widened at that, something unmistakably fond in his eyes. "Our restaurant," he agreed. They walked back out together, into the warm glow of the dining room, into the noise and laughter and the smell of dishes Clem had built from nothing but memory and stubborn hope. Somewhere near the bar, a server refilled glasses. Somewhere near the kitchen pass, her line cooks called out orders with the same rhythm she'd once used serving mojitos poolside, except now every single word of it belonged to her. The girl who'd been pushed into a pool and laughed at now stood at the center of the room she'd built, equal partner, respected leader, exactly where she was always meant to be.